A small coffin, no larger than a bread box, draped in white silk, was lowered into the earth while the wind howled through the royal chapel. No music, no eulogy, only a mother silent, pale and still clutching a lace bonnet too small to be remembered. This was not her first burial, and it would not be her last. Her name was Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, a foreign princess, a royal consort, a queen without a throne. But more than that, she was a mother, one who buried more children than she ever held for long. While others wrote history in blood and ambition, Augusta's story was carved into lullabies that faded too soon, into empty nurseries that forgot the sound of laughter, and into footprints that never grew. This is not a tale of war or scandal. This is the slow unraveling of a woman stitched into duty, corseted by sorrow, and embalmed in silence. Tonight, we walk not toward a coronation but toward a grave. Not one grave, but many. And behind each one, a heartbeat that once called her mother. She was just 16, too young to understand what it meant to belong to another country, too well raised to say no. Born into the minor nobility of a fractured Germany, Augusta had been trained in Latin, needlework, and stiff manners, but not in grief, nor in England, nor in how to survive a loveless court. In 1736, she arrived in London, barely speaking English. Days later, she was married to Frederick, Prince of Wales, a stranger, a future king, a man who saw her not as a wife, but as a womb and brocade. The wedding vows were spoken in a language she didn't fully understand, but she smiled. That was her job now. She learned English through nursery rhymes and medical texts because childbirth would come before conversation. Her only confidant was the clavichord in a forgotten corner of the palace. She sang through her fingers because she had no voice. Then she became pregnant. The court rejoiced. The prince smiled. The kingdom cheered, but Augusta was afraid. In May 1737, she gave birth to her first son, George, a future king. They celebrated. She did not, because in that moment she realized her body was no longer hers. It was a factory, a cradle, a coffin, and the birthing never stopped. 9 children followed, 9 journeys through blood and fear. Each time she gave life, she stared down death. Each time she bled, she whispered, "Will this one stay?" And each time she loved, she risked losing. Augusta's motherhood was judged cold. They called her stiff, German, too formal, too distant. But what they never understood was this: she wasn't afraid of being a mother. She was afraid of grief, because love, to her, meant eventual loss, and loss meant silence. Her husband paraded the children like trophies, denied her a voice in their care, reminded her that she was chosen to bear heirs, not to feel. Her affection was measured, cautious, a kiss when no one looked, a lullaby hummed behind closed lips, a letter slipped beneath a nursery door. She existed beside her children, but never fully with them. Even her own blood came with boundaries, boundaries she never chose, and the palace echoed with that absence. Then came the morning when silence grew too loud. A crib still, a child cold. No warning, no fever, no injury, just absence. They called it crib death, a tragedy, a fluke. But grief does not care for medical terms. Augusta stood at the cradle, surrounded by servants who dared not speak. She looked down at the son she would never raise, not an heir, not a king, just a child, her child. And she realized there are no royal instructions for mourning. She didn't cry, not then, not there. She returned to her room, closed the door, and screamed into a pillow until her voice was gone. That night, a coffin barely larger than a drawer was ordered. She wasn't allowed to attend the burial. "You must rest," they told her. "Let the servants handle it." But how do you rest when your child is being lowered into the earth? She lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She held the christening gown they had saved for a portrait that would never come, traced the embroidered initials with her fingers, and for the first time she didn't feel royal. She felt hollow. And yet the palace moved on. So did Frederick. "We must try again," he said. These things happen. But Augusta had already lost more than a child. She had lost faith in her marriage, in the court, in the safety of joy. From then on, she avoided the nursery, stood at the door, hand on the handle, then walked away. They say kings are buried with gold, but Augusta buried her children one by one, and no crown could carry that weight. She stopped singing. Even the clavichord fell silent, its keys untouched, dust collecting where music once lived. Her next pregnancy came soon, too soon. The court cheered, the prince beamed, but Augusta was no longer hopeful. She moved through the pregnancy like a condemned prisoner walking a familiar hallway, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, waiting for the next sentence, because now motherhood no longer meant joy. It meant risk, it meant loss, it meant watching another child grow, only to wonder, how long do I have you? She began writing again in secret. They said I was cold, but if they knew the fire it takes to keep a smile. When your soul has gone to earth, I can no longer look at cribs without seeing coffins. I pray not that they live forever, but that they outlive me. These were not the thoughts of a mad woman. They were the thoughts of a mother whose grief had been denied oxygen and so burned inward quietly like coals beneath snow from the outside. Augusta remained unchanged, proper, poised, present. but inside something had curled up and stopped breathing. And that silence, that haunting, echoing silence, would follow her for the rest of her life, because no one prepares a queen for the sound of a crib that will never be filled again. The baby was gone, but the cradle remained. It stood in the corner of the nursery, polished perfect, untouched like a shrine. No one dared to dismantle. Servants dusted around it. Nannies walked past it with lowered eyes. Even Augusta, when passing the door, would glance at it with something that wasn't quite grief anymore, but something far worse, expectation, because in this palace there was always another child to come, another name to be written, another body to be risked. Within weeks of the funeral, Augusta was pregnant. Again, it was not a choice. It was a requirement. The court needed an heir and a spare, and perhaps a dozen more after that. But Augusta was still bleeding, not visibly, not dramatically, but within. Her body was still hollow from the loss, still recovering from the tearing, the fever, the silent nights of cramping pain and blood-soaked sheets, still haunted by the phantom weight of a child who would never cry again. She should have been allowed to rest, to breathe, to grieve, but queens don't grieve. They produce. Her stomach swelled again before her heart had even shrunk back to size, and this time the pain was different, sharper, less forgiving. Each kick from within felt less like life and more like punishment. Each month passed with dread. She stopped counting the days, stopped preparing the nursery, stopped sewing gowns, because hope had become a dangerous thing, a blade with a ribbon tied around it. By the 7th month, Augusta could barely walk without wincing. Her hair began to fall, not in clumps but in long fine strands that clung to her brushes like whispers. She bled more than she should. She grew pale, then gray. Doctors came and went with leeches and tonics and Latin phrases that sounded like rituals more than remedies. They called it female weakness. They prescribed stillness. They whispered about melancholy, but it wasn't melancholy. It was a body giving out under the weight of too many graves to little rest, and no one willing to say she is not well. The walls knew. They had seen this before. Other royal women crushed quietly beneath the pressure of reproduction, but walls do not speak. Her bed became her world, not the royal canopied bed of portraits and ceremonies, but a prison of linen and sweat. The curtains stayed drawn. The fire burned low. The air was thick with lavender and silence. She would wake at night and reach for a child who wasn't there, would press a hand to her stomach and wonder not if the child would live, but whether she would survive this one. The loneliness was total. Even her ladies-in-waiting grew cautious, afraid to ask how she felt, afraid to witness another unraveling. Frederick visited less and less. He had never been fond of sick rooms. They reek of failure, he once said, and so she labored again in silence, without joy, without song. The child was born blue, but breathing. A girl she lived, but Augusta did not rejoice. She simply stared, eyes wide, unblinking, as the midwife placed the baby in her arms. She's healthy, they said. A blessing, they said, but to Augusta the child was not a blessing. She was a promise that death would return, that love would once again be asked and punished. She handed the baby to the nurse and rolled over her back to the room outside the palace, resumed its routine. The court announced the birth with fanfare. The people toasted the princess. The nursery was repainted in soft pastels. New gowns were ordered. Portraits were arranged, but within Augusta's private chambers, time stood still. The cradle, once empty, now rocked again, but the room remained cold, uninviting, because warmth had become dangerous. It had betrayed her too many times. One by one more children came, and one by one the cradle would hold them and then release them to tutors, to illness, to expectation, to death. The nursery became a carousel filled with movement, but no joy in Augusta. Augusta became a silhouette, a mother in form, not in presence, a name on a birth certificate, a shadow at the edge of the portraits. They said she was recovering, they said she was resting, they said she was strong, but strength does not always roar. Sometimes it just lies still, hoping the ceiling doesn't collapse. The palace was filled with cradles, but fewer and fewer cries. Each silence was louder than the last, each loss heavier than the one before, and Augusta began to feel like a house herself, a grand echoing thing, once full of life, now standing with too many rooms closed off, too many windows shuttered, too many memories buried under polished floors. And still she endured, because queens must, because mothers do, but the cost was steep, and it would only grow heavier. The cradle rocked again, this time not by hand but by memory. Augusta sat in the nursery one evening alone, the fire reduced to its final embers, the air stale with lavender and dust. Her newest child, her fifth, had been moved to another room. The doctors insisted the child needed better air, brighter light, stricter care. She didn't protest, not out loud, but that night she remained seated facing the cradle, listening. There was no child inside, just blankets folded, still warm, but she heard it, a faint coo, a flutter of breath, the soft thud of a baby kicking in sleep. She rose slowly, walked to the cradle, empty of course, yet in her mind the sound persisted like an echo from a hallway no longer there. She told no one, because if she admitted it they would say she was grieving too much, too long, too deeply, and that in court was a greater sin than sorrow. Augusta began to keep to herself. She declined social gatherings, skipped dinners, asked for her letters to be read aloud, because she couldn't concentrate on the words. When spoken to, she often didn't reply, not because she didn't hear, but because she was somewhere else, far beyond the marble halls and embroidered chairs. She was in the nursery always, even when her The body wasn't there. Her mind had sunk its roots in that room where time stopped and shadows breathed. Servants whispered that she was withdrawn. Ladies in waiting noticed how she stared into corners as if expecting someone. Sometimes she would call out her name softly as if testing it on her tongue. George, Elizabeth, Alfred, names that belonged to children both living and gone, but she never clarified which one she meant. She no longer trusted her own memory. Each child's face blurred, each voice overlapped, each laugh brief and borrowed from the last. At times she would smile at a maid thinking it was her daughter, or reach out to a footman believing him her son, and when corrected she would blink, apologize, then drift back into herself. The palace doctors called it female fragility. The clergy suggested more prayer. Frederick, her husband, rolled his eyes and asked for stronger wine. She's always been like this, he said, melancholic. The Germans are prone to it. No one intervened because Augusta's illness didn't scream, it whispered in whispers, and a royal household are easily drowned by applause and protocol. One day, a guest arrived at court, a noblewoman with 3 children in tow. The halls filled with laughter again, tiny shoes clicking against marble, hands tugging at skirts, voices rising and falling in careless joy. Augusta emerged from her chamber for the first time in weeks. She saw the children and stopped mid-step. Her hands began to tremble. One of the girls' curly hair, greenied, reminded her of her own daughter who had died just before her 2nd birthday. The memory hit not like thunder but like cold water, sudden, drenching, undeniable. She fell to her knees, not dramatically, just quietly. The noblewoman screamed. Servants rushed in. Someone tried to lift her, but she shook her head instead. She whispered, "Let her stay, she's only sleeping." There was no child beside her, but Augusta saw one. She felt one. The scene was cleaned. Quickly the queen was escorted back to her quarters. The children were removed from the hall. No one spoke of it again, but from that day forward the whispers changed. She's not grieving, they said. She's lost her senses. And in truth, they weren't wrong, but neither were they right, because what Augusta was losing was not her mind, it was her place in the world. Grief had made her invisible. Madness made her unpalatable. She became a ghost, not just of the nursery but of the palace itself. She wandered its halls with soft steps, trailing memories like silk scarves fallen from her sleeves. She attended court, less spoke only when spoken to, and when she did speak her voice was gentler, as if afraid it might wake someone at night. She took to sleeping with a small stuffed animal, a gift from one of her children long ago. She hid it under her pillow, not for comfort but as a totem proof that someone once had called her mama. One evening a servant reported hearing music, soft, hesitant notes played on the clavichord. No one had touched the instrument in years. When they entered the room, Augusta was seated there, her back straight, her fingers hovering above the keys. She wasn't playing, she was remembering the sound used to help them sleep, she said. No one responded. What could they say? How do you speak to a woman who walks through life in the shadow of her own nursery? They told her on a grey afternoon. Frederick, Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne, her husband, the man she had served beside for nearly 2 decades, was dead. It wasn't dramatic, no sword, no scandal, just a cough, then a fever, then silence. Pleuropneumonia, pneumonia, the doctor said. Fluid in the lungs. He had ignored the signs, kept attending banquets, kept laughing until his lungs drowned him from within. They sent a messenger to Augusta's quarters carrying the words like a knife in a velvet sheath: "Your Royal Highness, the prince has passed." She did not gasp, she did not weep, she only asked at what hour. Then she stood, walked to the window and watched the rain fall, as if trying to memorize the shape of loss. She had lost many things before: children, health, sleep. But this was different, not because she loved him deeply. Frederick had been many things, but warm was not one of them. No, this loss was political, symbolic. With his death, she was no longer the Princess of Wales, not yet queen, not quite widow. She was trapped in a space between roles, too central to be forgotten, too expendable to be trusted. And then came the real cruelty. The court denied her full mourning rites. She would not wear the thick black veils of a royal widow. She would not lead the funeral procession. It would confuse the public, they said. You are not queen. They offered her grey, not black, not the color of real grief, just a watered-down version of sorrow. But Augusta refused. She dressed in deepest black, not once, not twice, but for 5 years. Every dinner, every court appearance, every Sunday service she wore grief like armor, like rebellion. If they wouldn't give her mourning, she would be mourning. She became a shadow among velvet and candlelight, a figure people bowed to but avoided. She said little, smiled less, spoke only when necessary, and she kept her distance from her children because even in mourning the palace had ruled. George, her eldest, now stood at the center of everything. He was the heir. He was watched, controlled. She was told to step back, not to interfere with his education, not to visit him too often, let him grow into a man. The advisors warned, your influence must not soften him. So she obeyed. She watched from afar, and once again she became the ghost of a role she once embodied. But grief, as always, does not come alone. It waits and then it returns. Just as Augusta began to regain her breath, just as her black dresses became less heavy, another illness crept into the nursery. Her youngest daughter, Caroline, barely 4 years old, fell ill with smallpox. They tried everything, herbs, mercury, prayer. Nothing worked. Caroline died within days. Her skin had turned to ash, her eyes cloudy, her tiny hands no longer warm. Augusta was not permitted at her bedside. Infection risk, they said. So she stood behind the nursery, door, listened to the coughing, and when it stopped she knew another coffin, another cradle empty. The funeral was quick, modest. The court was weary of mourning, but Augusta was not. She wore a black veil that covered her entire face, not out of formality, but because behind it she allowed herself to weep. The tears were quiet but real, the kind that leave trails behind the eyes, the kind that alter the shape of a voice after Caroline's death. Augusta stopped playing music entirely. The clavichord in her chamber remained closed, its ivory keys yellowed from disuse. She also stopped writing. Her journals, once filled with desperate prayers and whispered grief, were now blank. She no longer had the words, only silence, and silence in her world had become the only truth. She refused. Visitors refused letters. She spoke on occasion to the portraits in the gallery, called them by names that belonged to children now buried, sat beside the fireplace and whispered lullabies to no one. The palace. They began to whisper again. This time they did not call her cold, they called her haunted. She wears her mourning like skin, one courtier said. I'm not sure she even remembers who she was before the coffins, but Augusta remembered. She remembered every name, every face, every fever, every cradle lowered into the ground. She remembered the first time she held each child and the last time she touched them, and the difference between those moments was always shorter than it should have been. Now, with her husband gone, her youngest gone, and her eldest drifting into the hands of politicians, Augusta had nothing left to bury except herself. She didn't die, not then, but a part of her folded inward, like a letter never sent, like a song never finished, and what remained was not a queen, not a princess, not even a mother, just a figure in black, pacing the palace halls, trailing the scent of lavender and dust, a living eulogy for a family that never got to grow old. Together, Augusta had buried her husband, she had buried her children. But what she did not realize, at least not at first, was that she was now expected to bury herself, not literally, just politically. When Frederick died, the court moved fast, not to console Augusta, but to contain her. George, her eldest son, was now heir to the throne, and George was still only a boy, which meant Augusta, in theory, stood at the threshold of power as mother to the future king. She might have become a queen in all but name, a regent, a guide, a force behind the curtain, but the men around her had other plans. They feared her grief, they feared her German blood. They feared the silence that clung to her like a veil, and most of all they feared what she might do with that silence, so they built walls around her. Not stone, not brick, but rules, advisors, distance. They told her it was for the prince's benefit, that George needed to grow independently, to be raised in the English style, to be educated under the best minds of the realm. He must not be overly influenced by foreign softness. One minister said foreign soft. She heard the words clearly. They were speaking of her. They removed her from his daily lessons. They restricted her visits. They screened her correspondence at court functions. She was placed further from the king. At dinners she was asked not to speak of politics. She was not banned, she was not exiled, she was politely erased, a presence with no gravity, a mother with no access. Augusta did not fight them, not directly. She had learned long ago the confrontation only gave her enemies sharper blades. Instead she moved with calculation. She remained visible, dressed impeccably in black, her posture flawless, her silence heavy enough to fill rooms. She wrote to George short letters, carefully worded, not of power, but of health, of manners, of memory. Remember to pray every evening. Your father would have wanted you to lead with dignity. I miss your voice sometimes, he replied. Sometimes he didn't. She understood. He was a boy being shaped by hands she could no longer see, hands that wanted to mold him into a weapon, not a son. But still she tried. She sent him books from her private library. She planted trees in the garden with his name carved on small plaques. She whispered his name in prayers even when no one was listening, perhaps especially then. But as years passed, so did proximity. The court changed. Ministers came and went. George grew into a man. In Augusta she remained, not as a guide, not as a regent, but as a threat. They said she was too influential, that her opinions could sway votes, that her devotion to the old Protestant order might disrupt the carefully balanced factions of Parliament. And so they moved her subtly to Kew Palace, a royal residence, yes, but also a quiet one, far enough from Whitehall, far enough from her son, far enough from relevance. It wasn't a punishment, not officially. They called it retreat. They said she needed peace. They praised her resilience in public, but the message was clear. You have done your duty, now disappear. At Kew she received fewer visitors. Her letters were still monitored, her role reduced to ceremonial gestures. Attending births, baptisms, funerals, always funerals, she became the permanent mourner of the dynasty, the black-clad backdrop to every chapter of royal life. And yet she endured, not out of stubbornness but out of principle. She still kept portraits of her children, all of them, even the dead, even the forgotten. She spoke of them often, as if they had never left at court. This was called eccentric. At Kew it was her liturgy. One day, when asked by a court lady why she kept so many portraits of her late daughter, Augusta replied, because the court forgets, but I do not. And someone must remember the ones too small to be buried with legacy. She never wrote memoirs, never granted interviews, never defended herself. She let the silence speak for her, because in a palace that tried to erase her, silence had become her loudest weapon. And even in exile she remained a mother, not in title, not in power, but in essence, in every breath, in every stitched hem of black fabric, in every paused sentence where a name used to be. She had lost her voice in court, but she still where I spoke in the way her grief reshaped the air around her. And history, for all its noise, would not be able to ignore her forever. History, like grief, is never unanimous. For every monument built 100 names are erased, and for every woman who lived behind palace walls there are 1,000 versions of her, none entirely true and none entirely false. So what became of Augusta of Saxe-Gotha in the eyes of those who survived her? That depended on who you asked and what they needed her to be too. Some she was the cold mother, formal, rigid, overbearing. They pointed to her stern letters, her strict rules, her refusal to embrace the social warmth expected of royal women. They described her as controlling, especially over her son, George III, a mother who sought to shape a king from the shadows. She never smiled, one courtier recalled, even at weddings, even at births, as if joy had become unseemly. The historians who favored politics over emotion often painted Augusta in gray, a placeholder, a figurehead, a necessary participant in the machinery of monarchy, no more, no less. But others saw something different, not a cold woman but a wounded one, not distant but guarded, not controlling, just clinging, because when a woman has buried more children than she has dressed for their first ball, when her letters outlive her children's voices, when her lullabies fade long before her name becomes irrelevant, she builds walls not to trap others but to stop herself from bleeding out the women who served her at Kew long after the royal spotlight faded. Described a quieter Augusta, a woman who walked her garden in the morning mist, always alone, a woman who still laid out toys in her private rooms, not for living grandchildren but for those who never grew, a woman who prayed not for victory but for reunion. One maid said she never asked for pity, but once when she saw me crying over a bird I buried in the garden, she said, "You've already learned more than most kings ever do." Some modern scholars would later refer to her as the ghost matriarch, a maternal figure who haunted British royalty long after her death. Her son, King George III, rarely spoke of her in public, but in private he ordered her portraits kept. He preserved her letters, and when he lost his own child, the first of many, he was said to have whispered, "Now I understand her silence." Others weren't so generous in political discourse, especially during George III's reign and eventual mental decline. Augusta became a target. Pamphlets mocked her as the German spider, spinning webs of influence, trapping English sons in maternal guilt. Caricatures showed her holding marionette strings, guiding her son like a puppet. Her eyes always shaded, her mouth sewn shut, her hands clenched tight over her own heart. Even in satire they could not imagine her letting go. But what no pamphlet captured and no painting dared depict was the quietest truth of all, that Augusta's greatest ambition was never power, it was preservation of memory, of names, of a family history soaked not in glory but in loss. She never built a palace, she never commanded an army, she never sat on a throne, but she remembered each birth, each fever, each coffin, each name, and in remembering she resisted oblivion, because that is what grief does. When you carry it long enough it becomes religion, not a loud one, not a church with bells, but a private altar in a woman's mind, lit with the candles of names. No one says aloud anymore. Her journals, those that survived, read like scripture, not of God but of mourning. They say, "I linger too long in sorrow, but what else is left when joy does not linger for me? My son speaks with confidence, now I hear my words in his voice. May they not become knives in his mouth. I do not wish to be remembered, only not to be misunderstood." And that final line, that plea not for fame but for clarity, would echo centuries later, because Augusta was not a villain nor a saint. She was something harder to define, a mother who lived too long past her children, a woman who endured her own disappearance. Not many would that have survived what she did, and perhaps fewer still would have survived becoming what she had to be, a figurehead of grief. A statue that no sculptor wanted to chisel, but that history left standing anyway, because in the end, even history could not decide, was she a stranger to the English court or a saint among the forgotten? The answer, like grief itself, remains incomplete. Augusta never posed for a grand state portrait after her husband's death. There would be no oil painting of her in regalia, no frozen image of her holding a scepter, no dramatic canvas proclaiming her lineage, her power, or her triumphs. No, the last portrait of Augusta, the one that survives in archives and quiet galleries, is something entirely different. She sits in a modest chair, back straight, hands folded in her lap, no crown, no velvet, only a simple black dress, the same she had worn for years. Behind her, a heavy curtain to her left, the edge of a clavichord unplayed. Her expression is unreadable. Not stern, not gentle, but still, as if someone had asked her to smile, and she had simply declined. The painter had asked if she wanted any objects placed in the scene, a family ring, a religious token, a miniature of her son, the king. Augusta refused, but she did request one item, barely visible in the final canvas, a folded white bonnet placed on the corner of the clavichord, the same bonnet her infant son had worn before he died. No one commented on it. The artist left it in half in shadow, easily missed by the casual viewer, but Augusta never looked away from it. That portrait was never displayed publicly during her lifetime. It hung in a back hallway of Kew Palace beside landscapes and forgotten still lives. Visitors rarely saw it. Servants dusted it with respectful silence, and when Augusta died, they nearly removed it to plain, said one court official. Too sad, but someone. No record shows who insisted it stay. It is the truest image of her, they wrote. Let her remain as she was, unadorned, uncelebrated, unforgettable. Augusta died in 1772 at the age of 52, not old, but not young either. No fanfare marked her passing. The nation did not mourn deeply by then. George III was king in full. The court had moved on. The people remembered her, if at all, as the serious German widow. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, a place for monarchs for memory, but her grave was plain. No sculpture, no elaborate tomb, just a stone with her name, her titles, and a date. No mention of the children she bore, no line about the children she lost, no inscription that whispered of music or lullabybus or loss, just Augusta, Princess of Wales, consort to Frederick, mother to King George III. The rest, it seems, was left to dust, and yet her presence never quite vanished. Visitors to Kew Palace sometimes spoke of a heaviness in the halls, a silence that lingered too long in the nursery, a piano key that pressed itself down when no one touched it, a faint scent of lavender and wax. Folklore perhaps, but history too has its ghosts, and Augusta was one of them in family records. She appears as a footnote in official documents, a transition, but in the margins, in the diaries, the nursemaid's notes, the scattered letters, her outline returns a mother who kept mourning, a woman who chose silence not because she had nothing to say, but because no one truly listened. That final portrait was eventually moved not to a throne room, not to a national gallery, but to a small corner of the royal collection, hung near a child's watercolor across from an unfinished painting of a crib. It still hangs there today, unremarkable at first glance, until you see the bonnet, until you notice the clavichord, until you realize this is not a portrait of a princess, it is a portrait of grief. The kind of grief that refuses to fade, not because it is loud, but because it knows how to wait. Wait in the corners of rooms, wait behind closed nursery doors, wait in the pages that no one reads until someone someday finally wonders, who was she, not just as consort, not just as mother to a king, but as Augusta, the woman who buried her children and was never buried properly. In memory, there are women in history who move mountains, raise kingdoms, command armies, and then there are women who are tasked with surviving not wars but funerals, not betrayal but silence, not exile but erasure. Augusta of Saxe-Gotha was not remembered for her brilliance or her beauty or her battles. She was remembered, if at all, for her proximity to power, for being the wife of a prince who never became king, the mother of a king who outgrew her, the occupant of a palace that gradually emptied around her. But that is not the truth, not the real one, because Augusta's reign was not over subjects, it was over shadows. She ruled grief, she governed memory, she preserved the names the kingdom forgot to write down. In a world where women were valued for the children they could bear, she lived long enough to bury most of them, and in doing so she became something the monarchy feared most, a mirror, not a mirror of glory but of cost. She was the cost of lineage, of empire, of legacy. She wore that cost in black, wore it when the bells stopped ringing, when the nurseries were silent, when the portraits were taken down, and still she stood, not in defiance, not in triumph, but in a posture so steady, so quiet it became unshakable. We often mistake quietness for absence. We assume that if someone does not scream, they are not in pain. If they do not protest, they do not resist. If they do not speak, they must have nothing to say. But Augusta challenges that assumption. She teaches us that grief, true grief, is not a spectacle. It is a companion, that some people do not want to be remembered loudly, they want to be remembered correctly. She is not a tragic heroine, she is not a political martyr, she is not a legend, she is something far more human. She is the echo of every mother who outlived her child, the breath that catches when a memory surfaces unexpectedly, the shadow that lingers in places where love once lived. And if we are wise, we will not pity her, we will not reduce her to her black dresses and her silences. We will see her for what she truly was, a woman who bore the weight of dynasties and still reached out to cradle absence with both hands. In the end, Augusta left behind no monuments, but maybe grief does not need marble. Maybe all it needs is someone somewhere to remember, not the titles, not the crown, but the woman, the mother, the ghost in the nursery, who never stopped whispering their names. Thanks for watching. See you in next one.